Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Leadership Where It Matters Most. Today's guest is Father Paul Scalia. Father Paul is a priest of the Diocese of Arlington. He is a pastor. He is the Vicar General of that diocese. He is an author. He is a frequent speaker at conferences. And I had the great privilege of meeting Father Paul when I went down to Florida, to Boynton Beach, to present to newly ordained priests and do about a 4-day workshop on leadership. And he and I had a brief opportunity and chance to share a glass of wine and muse on different things. It was a really just great conversation. Of course, I had known Father Paul because I think the first time I actually got to know him is when I watched a homily that he gave for his father, who, for those of you who know, is Antonin Scalia, the great conservative voice and long time serving member on the Supreme Court down in the States. And just a beautiful homily that Father Paul gave in honor of his father. We don't talk a lot about his dad, but we did talk a little bit about his testimony and growing up and what faith meant to him and that kind of thing. And then, of course, his calling into priesthood, and the rest of it is history kind of from there. So it was a really wonderful, rich conversation. After we were speaking about a little bit about his testimony, I wanted to know a little bit about the Diocese of Arlington, because it's only been operating as a diocese since 1974. They've only had 4 bishops in that diocese. So just to find out how that happened and a little bit of the lay of the land in that diocese. We spent a lot of time talking about the state of men today and the need for fraternity, the important voice of somebody like Jordan Peterson, what he is speaking to men and why it is resonating with men, particularly young men these days. We kind of then took that and applied some of that, and that animated our conversation about the state of priesthood and seminaries and the unfortunate isolation that a lot of men who are serving as Christ's priests in today's church are experiencing, and what they need and the fellowship that they need and the ongoing formation, the human formation and all that. So Father Paul is just one of these guys who I love spending time with. He's so wise. He's so grounded, such a clear disciple. He could speak on so many things. I mean, he's one of these guys that feels like he's an expert in everything. So put a plug out there. He's actually going to be in Vancouver in November, I believe, for an opportunity. Maybe I should wait and see because something might happen and may not go through, but I'm pretty sure he's going to be in Vancouver in November. Sorry to put that out there, but if he is, it's going to be an absolute blessing for the diocese, as he's got so much wisdom. So, hey, thanks for tuning in and enjoy this episode with Father Paul Scalia. Father Paul Scalia, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Brett, it's an honor to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
It was a joy to meet you when I was down in Florida. We had some short time.
Well, you had just had a really long journey, and I was just impressed that you were able to keep up with us with your pipe and I think some scotch.
That's right. I think I had wine that night, but definitely the pipe came out. It was just a joy. Really good to meet you. And again, thanks for doing this. Many people are going to know who you are. Some may not. So why don't you start off by just telling us a little bit about your story?
Yeah. Well, I'm the 6th of 9 kids. Mom and dad, very solid in their faith. They met as Catholics. Both were at Harvard at the time, Harvard and Radcliffe, technically. So yeah, we grew up in a very, I don't want to say pious household because we didn't pray a whole lot, but there was a strong conviction and certainty that what the church taught was true, and this is who we are. And we go to Mass every Sunday, and we confess our sins, and this is who we are. And when you're one of 9, and we moved around a lot when I was growing up, boy, that gives you an identity, right? You move into town and you're 9 kids, and people, you have to kind of own who you are. So that was kind of the atmosphere growing up. And there was just this, and my parents would have priests over for dinner fairly often. My dad had a friend of his in high school, was one of the first Opus Dei priests in our country. So I kind of grew up in that atmosphere of that sort of comfort with the faith and with priests, and just the knowledge that this was true and that this is important and this defines who we are. And then, in high school, just got more serious about my faith and met a a priest, got to know the priest in our parish very well, and he really taught me how to say prayers, the rosary. And I would go to Eucharistic adoration and things like that. That was a great blessing, and he really inspired in me the thought of the priesthood.
Mm.
I didn't let it bother me that much
Yeah.
in high school and a lot of college. But going into my, I guess, junior year of college, I had interiorly made the decision I was pretty certain that I was going to enter the seminary. And then going into my senior year, I started telling my friends that I was going to enter the seminary. And, some of the things that really drew me to that were, I guess, principally the conviction that, well, something's wrong, right? Something's wrong in the world. And that what the Catholic Church teaches and what she provides through her sacraments are the solution to what's wrong. And it doesn't suddenly make everything beautiful and perfect, but it is her truth and her grace, those things that the church bears throughout history and throughout the world that man's heart is really searching for. And I had also, I grew up in a pretty, I guess today we would say privileged area of the country in McLean, Virginia. So a lot of my classmates came from very wealthy families, but I knew that they still had problems.
Mm.
And then I went to a small liberal arts college, Jesuit college up in Massachusetts, and that was expensive as well. And so somewhat self-selective in the people that went there. And I saw suffering among them also. And so that really alerted me to the interior dimension of man's suffering and of what we really desire. Just one last moment that's kind of on, in my mind from my vocation stories. I interned on Capitol Hill between, I guess it was junior and senior year of college. And I was bustling about as an intern. And in Washington, D.C., interns think that they're very important, but
Mm.
really they're kind of plankton on the food chain. And so I'm bustling about, and I was delivering some package over to one of the Senate offices. And I had a real graced moment in which it just kind of occurred to me that as important as all this stuff is, it doesn't reach what needs to be reached.
Mm.
And what needs to be reached is the interior of man. And that is done by the teaching of truth and the conveying of grace. And that's what a priest does. And that's what nobody in public policy can do.
Mm.
So that was the summer that I spoke to the vocations director. I said, yes, let's start this.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's been borne out in my priesthood. That's kind of been the theme throughout my priesthood. I was very blessed that I didn't have any doubts throughout the seminary. I think once I'd made that decision, that was it. That's been kind of throughout my priesthood, just growing in that conviction that our need to articulate the truth of Christ with clarity and charity. And that's what people really desire, that the human heart is made for this. And we have this, and we just have to work as hard as possible to bring these two things together, the longing of the human heart and the truth of grace that the Catholic Church brings into the world. So it's been a great gift. I'm a priest almost 27 years, and yeah, just a great blessing to see that effective and when people respond. In fact, there was somebody not well in an East Coaster's estimation of things. This woman was close by you. She lived in Portland. Liz Lovett, and she was she was in this area when she converted to Catholicism, and she remains in my mind as somebody who assimilated the Catholic faith like immediately. Like I presented, we meet and I teach the faith, and she just immediately grasped it, and it was transformative. So that's been a great blessing at moments like that.
Thank you for your yes, Father. 27 years ago, 27 years ordained. I mean, you speak about your family, and I mean, I've got to say it just for those who recognize your name or perhaps recognize you and know your story. Your mother, Maureen, your father, Antonin, obviously Supreme Court Justice for what, 1,000 years or something, whatever his tenure was?
It was it 30? Yes,
Yeah,
from 1986 to 2016, yeah.
Yeah, and you give me hope because our family, we've got 8 kids. You come from 9, we have 8, and we've moved 10 times since we've been married, twice across the country. So you bring me hope that it's not going to be too scarring on the kids, but they're all doing well and thriving. So very grateful. So Father, you're a priest of the Diocese of Arlington, and that's a unique diocese. At least it is to me, because it's quite new. I think it was only founded as a diocese in 1974. Can you just give us some of the history, just for those of us who are a part of a diocese and a church that thinks in decades and hundreds? but it's a relatively new place. How did that even happen?
Well, this is the 50th anniversary of our founding, so I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
Originally, it was just the Diocese of Richmond, and the Diocese of Richmond was all of Virginia, which is enormous. That's about 8 hours east to west. And I think it also still at that time took in West Virginia. And then in 74, Richmond and Arlington were split apart. And a lot of that had to do with just the demographics. Northern Virginia was growing a lot, and it had been since the Second World War, and there were two very different cultures in Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia. That is increasingly the case. And I remember running into a guy when I was in New England, running into a guy from Virginia, and I said, "Well, I'm from Virginia." And he asked me where. And I told him, and he said, "Well, you're not from Virginia. You're from Northern Virginia." and
Yeah.
and so that demographic shift was was one big reason for it. Yeah, so we're founded in 1974. Bishop Welsh from Philadelphia was our first bishop, and one of the first things he did was he brought in Poor Clare nuns
Hmm.
to pray for vocations. And still today, one of the first tasks of a newly ordained priest is to go and to preach the novena for St. Clare the August after his ordination,
Oh, wow.
because this sort of ingratitude to the Poor Clare nuns for their prayers and sacrifices for priestly vocations. And we've been blessed with a very good number of priestly vocations. I was one of 13. We're only ordaining 2 this year, which in many places would be something to rejoice about it, and we are rejoicing. But next year we'll ordain 12.
Wow.
We are very blessed, and that comes about. I mean, the soil has been tilled so well in terms of what I was talking about earlier, and this is probably what put it in my mind. Right, is a clarity of teaching, a reverence in the liturgy, a confidence in the sacraments. We had on Good Friday and Holy Saturday, we had 5 priests in my parish hearing confessions for 2 to 3 hours
Wow.
each day. So
Yeah.
so that gives you a sense of the confessional practice and that the habits of the faithful in the diocese. And so growing up with that sort of things, like, wow, that's the real gift of the diocese. So we have a lot of other things that have really built up the diocese, like Christendom College. I think deserves mention
Mm.
because it was founded not too long after the diocese, and that's been a great source of vocations and of good solid education. We have great resources and the professors there. So those are, I think, the elements that have gone into making it, a very special diocese. We've opened a number of churches recently. The bishop has dedicated a number of new churches being built. Now, I do have to say that demographically, we're growing in every other respect too, this area.
Mm.
And so if the church were not growing, that would be a sign of very bad health. In New England, for example, a place like Buffalo or Hartford, that those places, the church is really declining there, but so is everything else. So we have a lot of people moving into this area. The only thing that continues to grow is the federal government. And so that's, right across the river and throughout our diocese. So we have a lot of people coming for that. Yeah, we're very blessed to have a great slew of very faithful, reverent, and generous priests here. And I think that's what really built it up. And that comes from a lot of the faithful, generous, reverent families that are in the diocese.
Yeah. Certainly, I've heard a lot of things about the vocations and how healthy they are, just the sheer volume and numbers, which is great. That's wonderful. You mentioned Christendom College, and I know you're sort of friends to the Franciscan Sisters of the Holy Eucharist. Do you
Right.
remember a Sister Timothy Prokes at Christendom by chance?
Oh, sure. Was she at Christendom? I don't know that she was at Christendom. I know her just by way of the Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist.
Yeah, she was there a short time because she was actually stationed in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, believe it or not, when I was a university student there.
She keeps going. She's going to bury all of us.
Yeah, I know. It's quite beautiful to see. Thank you for that. I want to shift gears, Father, because there's a lot of things I want to talk to you about. And there's this great line from Henry David Thoreau when he said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And as one who's been involved in men's ministry and in some leadership development with clergy, I don't think much has changed over 300 years. I think that there is still a lot of kind of under the surface, the thin veneer of our hearts. There's an ache that a lot of men are experiencing. They're not experiencing perhaps the life that they know God has promised them, abundant life and all that. Is that what you see? Do you think that's the case, or are men doing just fine these days?
Well, yes, you know the answer to that. They are not. You know, it's interesting that I think the parish. I'm very edified by the men in my parish. I have a lot
Mm,
of good husbands and fathers that provide good example. But of course, I think it's that kind of man that comes to Catholic parishes, and I think it's because he's coming to that Catholic parish that he becomes that kind of man. But I think there are a lot of guys on the margins who simply are not, and I think that is a lot of them, and there are plenty within our parish who experience that as well. That the life of quiet desperation, as Thoreau said. So I do think that is the case. I think it's probably one of my frustrations is that we've been deprived of heroes.
mm,
We've been deprived of men to look up to. This was one of the crazy things in 2020 throughout the United States with the tearing down of statues,
right.
which was completely indiscriminate. By the way, in Texas, somebody vandalized a statue of Stevie Ray Vaughan, the great country blues guitarist.
Of course. Any statue was vulnerable.
Because a statue, you erect a statue to somebody that you admire and somebody that you think other people should imitate, and not everything about that person. We don't even say that about the saints, right? There's certain things about the saints you shouldn't imitate.
Yeah.
But in the secular world, we have been deprived of heroes. Men have been deprived of that standard that we can point to and say, "Hey, that's a good guy to imitate." And so I think that makes things all the more difficult. And then, of course, the breakup of the family is terrible for wives and mothers. It's terrible for children, and it's terrible for men because they lose. Well, okay, now what is this all about? What does it mean to be a father? How can I be a father if I'm separated from the mother? And what does it mean to be a husband? So losing our bearings in that way, and of course, just the breakdown of the family in general is, a lot of men hasten that, unfortunately, but even more men suffer from that. So I think that is very much the problem today. I think also, a man used to need to provide and protect. That was his kind of foundational mission. And now we have welfare systems and social services such that man doesn't really need to do that. The police, you can call the police, and
Mm,
there are social safety nets that will continue to provide for you. Barack Obama had that campaign ad that was all about this one woman who really from cradle to grave was taken care of by the federal government, and it was a very telling ad because there was no man, and a man he needs to know that he's needed. And what we're discovering is that a man protects and provides in ways that are more important than the material and
mm,
physical. That he protects and provides in a spiritual manner in terms of character and human formation. That really is where husband and father is needed most, where men are needed most. And so we're in a situation now where we have to realize that why is a man important in a child's life? Why is a father important? It's not just because he protects and provides materially, but spiritually he provides what is needed for the child.
mm. That's great. I want to kind of springboard a little bit and talk about sort of the state of where priests are at these days, Father, because I have, I guess, more opportunities to interact beyond just the friendships that I have with priests and bishops. I'm speaking of presbyterates and all that. And I just sense that there's this gap between my own kind of anecdotal experience of where the men are at, our clergy, and what is coming out in some of the, even fairly modern recent studies that are showing, priests have very high degree satisfaction rates, job engagement, all these different categories. And what I have found, and we were talking about this before, but the layer going a little bit deeper is that I think the ones who are almost struggling are those who are even more perhaps conscientious, if you will, than the average, because I think their level of conscientiousness makes them vulnerable to see the gap between what is and what could be, what they signed up for in terms of fraternity and even the opportunity, as you say, to provide and protect as spiritual fathers. What are you seeing? Does that resonate in any way? Does that kind of confirm your own experience?
Yeah, I confess that I don't like those surveys that try to gauge happiness,
Hmm.
because what is happiness is is one of the most ancient questions, one of the most disputed questions. And I don't. I think a lot of times, and priests included, we can confuse comfort with happiness.
Mm.
I think a guy can present himself as happy, but the further question is he fulfilling his duties?
Mm.
He might be happy, but is he serving the people of God generously? Yeah, I think it's right that those who are conscientious are that's probably, downside of being conscientious. Like, gosh, if you didn't care, you wouldn't be unhappy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the things that I think burdens men today is that we've lost a shared effort of work.
Mm.
We talked about the Diocese of Arlington earlier. Like, we have 6 priests in my rectory. Now, only 3 of them are actually assigned here. The other 3 are residents. One's a chaplain, 2 are students. But that really, I mean, it's a gift to have those others, because there's a spirit of common service, common labor in whatever we're doing, and that's a very important thing. And I think men just generally are lacking that.
Mm.
I think in a lot of places in the United States today, priests don't have that shared effort. They're living alone. They're ministering alone. That becomes a burden, and that's a very dangerous thing. I think this afflicts bishops too, because, well, I mean, the bishop's in charge, so he can't confide in just anybody. And it's a danger. I don't know. I think that we can put the mission ahead of our need for community and our need for fellowship. I think
Mm.
that's a danger. The missionaries at Charity, for example, not uncommon for them to close the soup kitchen or whatever else it is that they run. They close it for a day, one day a week, because that's their day to kind of tend to the things they need to tend to.
Yeah.
And so priests living together and taking time to be together is hugely important. And it's not a luxury. It's not like, oh gosh, they're kind of slacking off or whatever else. No, it's something that is necessary. And
Mm.
you know what? People sense that. People sense that. Just earlier this week, I was at a get together with some priests, and we were going to go hiking, but it was raining, and so instead of going hiking, we went to a local distillery and sat and had a whiskey.
Well, of course you would. That's the obvious alternative.
Right, right. Well, it was there. And so there were 7 of us, and we were all we're on lay clothes. We're in mufti. And as we're on the way out, a lady stops us and says, "Are you all priests?" And I immediately thought, man, are we that poorly dressed
Yeah.
in casual clothes that she can identify as priests immediately? But what she picked up on was the fraternity.
Mm. That's great.
And she probably got, snippets of our conversation, which thanks be to God, was edifying. But people, I think, greatly desire that, and they want to see that in their priests, and they know when priests have it, and they know when they don't.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think this is a huge concern for priests, and increasingly, because in most places priests don't live together, and and there needs to come a point where we say, you know what, we can't supply that parish over there won't have a full-time priest,
Mm.
because the priests are going to live together.
Yeah.
Now, it's easy for me to say because our parishes all
You
have
c-
that.
Yeah.
But I do think that taking care of that priesthood fraternity is increasingly important. And I think we have to realize that has to take precedent
Yeah.
over many other things that we do.
Yeah. It's funny because I think that priest fraternity and the desire to live in community is certainly one very strongly felt category for those conscientious priests that notice the gap. And even when I was in Florida, I was working with the regional seminary and all the young guys, the parochial vicars who come in. And I share this often when I'm with presbyterates, is that I find it strange that we're not experiencing more of a deep fellowship among priests. When you look at other sort of constituencies, particularly of men, like in the military or even sports teams or police officers, when they as a cohort go through something difficult, that difficulty is the catalyst for a band of brothers. And I think most priests in the West look at the culture, look at the demise of Christendom and all the rest of it. We're going through something. And yet it's not being met with a new experience of real fraternity. And that's not just sad, it's unhealthy. It's like, I'll say this and then I'll let you riff, but it's like so many marriages do not go to the level perhaps that the Lord would want them to, because the husband and wife don't make that very difficult decision of inviting the spouse to be an ally in their pursuit of holiness. Not an adversary, right? Not someone that's nagging and all the rest, but holding up a mirror and lovingly, noticing the gaps. And we're going to close these together and recognizing that where we grind is an opportunity for holiness and all the rest. That would be a beautiful thing to see among the fellowship of priests. But that's where I see as one of these gaps. But do you see the same thing? Like, it's odd that our priests are not running into more fellowship and fraternity given the state of things right now.
Yeah, I do think that it's happening more and more. So I do think that there is that response, especially among the younger priests. When I was ordained, fraternity in the rectory, it didn't even enter my mind. And not because I was opposed to it. It just wasn't an expectation of mine. And the men who are coming out of the seminary now, they expect that and they want that. And so it requires an adjustment on, priests of my generation, but it's a very good adjustment that we need that we need to make. I think also, what you just said there about holiness. Yeah, again, it's putting and this is a distortion of a male strength, right? Because we're mission focused, get her done, right?
Yeah.
It's the cable guy, not the cable gal, right?
Yeah.
Get her done. And so men, we have this sense, okay, I have to complete this mission. I've got to say mass, I got to hear confessions, I got to teach the faith. And that's true. These things need to be done and we need to work hard. But in the end, what the Lord wants is he wants to sanctify us. And if we are sanctified, then we become better instruments of sanctification for others. And so that's really kind of the should be, a purpose for living together, or at least an element of living together. Okay, are we striving for this together? It's always edifying when I walk into our rectory chapel and I see one of the other priests there, or see the breviary sitting out, sitting out on the table in the hallway. Just these different things that indicate, okay, the other guys, we're taking this seriously here.
That's great.
I do think that that's happening, and it's definitely something that needs to happen more. And it's interesting you compare it to like the military and the police, a band of brothers. Well, we're the only band of brothers that can't have sisters.
Yeah, exactly.
So we should be more band of brothers than anyone else.
Yeah.
A friend of mine's vocation story is much like that. He was sort of like hesitating about, does he have a vocation or not? And he went on a date with this girl, and part of the date, I don't know, was going to a high school basketball game. I don't know why, but there he saw the vocations director and like a whole crew of priests. And he said, yeah, I want that.
Yeah.
I want that fraternity. I want that camaraderie.
Isn't that great? That's awesome to hear. When I was down in Florida, Father, with all the parochial vicars, there was two consistent things they wanted to talk about sort of in relation to Canada. The first is they wanted my take on Justin Trudeau, our prime minister. And
I remember getting your take on that. It was unfiltered.
Yeah, I have some. Well, the pipe will do that. And the second was Jordan Peterson, not just because he's Canadian, but his impact, particularly on men. I mean, what do you see of that phenomenon? What do you think he's speaking to? And I'll just put this out there because you brought this up before. Jordan Peterson is one of those characters, I think perhaps one of the strongest characters right now, that as soon as you say his name, there's millions of people that think everything he says is right. And there's millions of people think that everything he says is wrong. And it's wrong because it's him saying it. Obviously, I think he says some great things, and I can't believe some of the things he posts on Twitter. So just putting that disclaimer out there. But what do you think of the phenomenon? Like, what is he speaking to that is hitting particularly the men's hearts so powerfully right now?
I think he values manhood and men being men, and the fact that there is such a thing as a man, and that which sounds
Imagine
absurd
that.
to say, and that there is such a thing as masculine virtues. I think that a lot of we hear talk about toxic masculinity. And yes, there can be men who act and speak in a toxic manner, or who try to live out their masculinity in that way. But masculinity in itself is not toxic, as a lot of people have presented it to be. And Jordan Peterson, I mean, when you see him speak about how boys and young men are beaten down, he gets very emotional, and it's very inspiring, because it's not a theoretical thing. I listened to his book, The 12 Rules for Life, and so you pick up a little bit of his background on that, and you see, yeah, he kind of a hard scrabble life. He saw what can happen to young men if they're not inspired with something, and I think that's our culture is not offering that, and he is. And so if people get upset with him, well, in a sense, they only have themselves to blame because men are going to respond to something, and you want them to respond to something good. And I don't agree with everything that he writes or says,
Hmm.
but I think something that is very attractive to men is that you're watching a man reason honestly,
Yeah.
and you're watching a man do something courageous intellectually, which is to follow a premise to its conclusion and to confront people who are not just erroneous but are imposing error on other people. There's something inspiring about that. When I was growing up and sitting in the pews, and this priest who was so influential in my life, he would kind of reason in his homily.
Mm.
He would walk us through the reasoning for different teachings and explaining the gospel, whatever else. And there's something I think that draws men in. I think they like that. It's not just feelings. They want to engage the mind. And so I think that attracts men to Jordan Peterson. And this priest also, he was very courageous in his preaching. I mean, he would confront the big issue, such that when I was a newly ordained priest and I gave a pro-life homily, I couldn't believe how surprised the people were. Because I just figured, well, if you're a priest, you have to, every so often you have to preach against abortion, right?
Yeah.
If you're a plumber, you might have to, fix some pipes that you don't want to fix that are kind of messy, but you do it. So this priest gave that good example of preaching courageous, and I think Jordan Peterson does a similar thing. He confronts error, and I think that's inspiring to men to see somebody standing up like that.
Yeah.
Even his whole thing about dressing, he's a sharp
Right.
dresser, and
Yep.
and it's like, well, oh, okay, yeah, and gosh, I'd love for him to talk to some of the men that walk into my office for marriage prep and things like that. I just want to say, why don't you dress properly? But there's that seems like a small thing, but it's not. It's showing respect for oneself and projecting respect of oneself and respect for others.
Absolutely.
That resonates with men.
One of the more powerful clips that I ever saw is basically he's saying that, it's not just okay to be a man, but there's a necessity for men. And he goes on to explain how men are often, working in these trades and, crazy hours and doing incredibly dangerous things. And it really touched me because most of our children have gone on, through university. One of our boys is in trades and he's doing a great job. And I literally wanted to go to the job site and just honor these men. And often now, and I have to dress in a suit every day, if I see construction workers that are kind of just standing, waiting for their job to do, I'll just walk up to them and say, you know what? Thanks for what you do. This is great. I really appreciate it. And they're like, who are you? What is this?
One of my summer jobs was building decks, and which is not like real hard construction. It's not hard labor. It's not like big time construction. But I was in work boots and I was out in the sun all day, and I remember stopping by the 7-Eleven, going to pick up lunch, and the real construction workers were there,
Yeah,
and kind of getting in line with them and thinking, these are all men here, and there's an unspoken camaraderie. I kind of felt, immediately accepted into that because, like, okay, you're out in the sun, working hard, and there's a respect to be shown for that.
absolutely. You got the steel boots on.
Yeah, this point about it's not just okay, but it's good.
Yes.
We need men to be men. I don't know if this line is original to Jordan Peterson, but it's something to the effect of, if you're afraid of strong men, wait till you encounter weak men. And of course, a weak man is, I mean, Pontius Pilate. We just heard about it, right? I mean, the ultimate weak man. I think that's another thing that resonates. And by the way, it's a very fatherly thing to do, to look at a young man and to say, you're good,
Mm,
and it's good that you're a man, and I want you to become, a good man. And I think men crave that.
absolutely. That's one of the things I noticed in him. We won't dwell too much on Jordan Peterson, but one of the things I appreciate about him is that it's not just cerebral and it's not just hard and fierce. There is a softness. There is a tenderness.
Yes,
And he manifests, like, I don't know if you saw this, but I mean, Tammy, his wife, was brought into the church, right, at Easter.
right.
And there's a clip that's gone pretty viral now where the EWTN interviewer just asked Jordan Peterson, what has this done kind of for your marriage? I don't know if you've seen this, Father, but you should watch it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to do that.
It's such a beautiful testimony to covenantal love. It's so good. And he's so like articulate and strong. And yet at the same time, he's manifesting very deep, wonderful emotion toward his wife. I love my wife, is how he starts it off. It's beautiful.
Just by the way, I just love the fact that when you were down in Florida, this is such a typical American thing. Oh, you're from Canada. And then they ask you about two people that, we could probably read about too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like
do you know them?
It's not like the Canadian websites are forbidden to us. We could read up on, on these figures as well.
Very true. It's funny.
Such a typically American thing.
Yeah. Father, one of the things that you're pretty passionate about is spiritual fatherhood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is it so important to you, and why is it so important in the world and in the church right now?
Yeah, I think we've already, touched on that a lot with Jordan Peterson in a sense. Well, it's important to me because I was a son who had a father, and not just my dad, but also I had spiritual fathers in my life. And so I know all that they did for me and how much they meant for me personally and how much I owe to them. So there's that, but also it's the passage from Malachi that the angel quotes to Zechariah in the temple to turn the hearts of fathers to their children and children to their fathers, really fathers to their sons and sons. That our entire story is about father and son, and Christ has come into the world. And the typical superficial, shallow Christian view is that he came into the world as God in order to tell us how to live, and he got crucified for it. But he was raised on the third day, so it ended happily, right? But he came into the world as the eternal Son of the Father to share that sonship with us. And whether you're a man or a woman, you are introduced into the sonship of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ doesn't have a daughtership; he has a sonship, and we're all introduced into that by way of baptism. So our entire story is about receiving the Father's love and receiving this spiritual fatherhood. So that's one reason. Another is because I see the lack of it when fathers do not step into that role, which is of course a perennial problem. But when men don't take the time to convey to their children that love and that affirmation, saying it is good that you exist, which might at times come with discipline, right? It's good that you exist, but not good that you did that. That is a father's role, and when that's not fulfilled, it's bad. Well, for the father, it's bad for the children, it's bad for society. One of the things that I think I really think modernity is a rebellion against fatherhood. John Paul II says the original sin is rebellion against fatherhood. So I think I can modestly say that modernism is too. But in this sense, that at the heart of fatherhood is a handing on of something. Patrimony is that word comes from the Latin, the duty or the office of the father. It's the father's role to hand down to his children the wisdom and the truth that he's received. So one of my favorite images for this is not actually a Christian image. It's from the Aeneid. Aeneas leaving Troy. Troy is being sacked by the Greeks, and Aeneas is leaving, and he's a portrait of piety. He is carrying his father on his shoulders, which reveals him as a pious son and one who has a reverence for what came before him, a reverence for tradition. And he's leading his son by the hand, which means that he is a reverent son who takes his fatherhood seriously and takes seriously his obligation to hand on to his own son what he had received from his father. And we have not done that as a nation. I'm sorry to say that we have failed to do that as a church. And that's a failure of fatherhood more than anything else. It's a failure of spiritual fatherhood to hand on those things. And so when that's not done, there's great danger. We talked about my upbringing a little bit, and I mentioned how being one of 9 children, we kind of automatically had an identity wherever we went.
Yeah.
My father certainly conveyed that, right? Kind of, and I think this is a fatherly thing, is to confirm children in who they are.
Yes.
So George Weigel has a great summary of what John Paul II did when he returned to Poland the first time after his election as Pope, the famous trip to Poland that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. George Weigel says that what John Paul II did there is he said to the Poles, you are not who they say you are. Let me remind you who you are. And he's confirming them in their identity as Christians. And that is a very, very fatherly thing to do. So let me confirm you in your identity. You are my beloved child. You're also a child of God, more importantly. And these are all the gifts I have to give you. The gift of these traditions and this wisdom and this truth that I've received from others.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. There's a lot there. One of the things that came to mind just as you talked about John Paul and the sin of fatherhood, like a mentor of mine many years ago provided to me a job description of fatherhood that I've not forgotten, has always animated everything I've tried to do, and is just constantly failure. And that is to paint an accurate image of God the Father by the brush of your example.
Oof.
Right? Aspiring, impossible, and yet very directive. And so much of what I think we see in terms of pain in the home is a result of that disengagement. You mentioned the weak men. And one of the things I thought about is that, in the scandals that the church has seen and people have endured and suffered because of it, there's the acts themselves by the men who perpetrated them. Then there's the weak men. In some cases, I'm not blanketing, this is how it always happened, but there's weak men who knew and did nothing.
Yeah. And that's unfortunately throughout history, right?
Yeah.
Beginning with Adam, right?
Yeah, exactly. He stood by. He was there. He was
Right.
in the garden, could have done something, and he didn't. And this is why I think what we fear the most as men is the inclination to passivity. And in many ways, I think that's what Jordan Peterson is speaking to.
Right.
It's like stand up, shoulders out,
Right.
head high, not arrogance, not ambition that's unbridled, but be present.
Well, it's interesting that in Chesterton, he writes about this, right? That we have the expression, be a man,
Yeah.
and you don't really say that about anything else. That we don't have the corresponding be a woman,
Right. Yeah.
and we wouldn't know what that is. As Chesterton says, you don't slap a crocodile on the back and say act like a crocodile. But a man really has that challenge before him. And a father, that advice, which is so poetically given and beautiful and haunting, that's what John Paul II says in different terms in Familiaris Consortio. That the mission of the father is to really relive the Father of God, like right there, to be that image.
Yeah. One of the things that's very clear, Father Paul, when I speak to you, is that there's no shame or embarrassment with you with the faith. Now that might sound obvious. You're a priest and you hold positions of influence and power and all the rest of it. But like I think it's quite beautiful to behold because it's not coming, I don't sense it's coming from a place of like pride or anything. It's just so grounded in understanding what the church, Jesus Christ, has to offer and what human needs are. And you just unabashedly know that Jesus Christ is the answer to our deepest longing. So all of that we've been talking about, especially for, the call to manhood and all that, it's really about bringing Christ's presence in the world. If you want to know what a man is and what a spiritual father is, ichi homo.
Right.
Behold the man.
Absolutely.
That's the privilege of discipleship.
Yeah, and Christ, Christ being the perfect image of the Father, right? And so to imitate him, to live as him is to real the Father. It's the line we had a couple weeks ago, leading up to Holy Week, when Philip says, show us the Father and we shall be satisfied, which is such a wonderful line, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the cry of the human heart. Just show us the Father, we'll be satisfied. And it's one of those scenes which you just get the sense that our Lord is kind of exhausted with the apostles. Is have I been with you for so long and still you do not know me? Whoever's seen me, seen the Father. Well, here's a daunting thing. Jesus was crucified because he revealed the Father as the Son. That's why. It's because he is the eternal Son of the Father. He claimed that, and they said that's why he was put to death. We shouldn't expect our attempt to do the same to be easy or to be unopposed. To live that out is going to encounter opposition the same way Christ's living out of his sonship and his imaging of the Father was opposed and met with conflict.
Mm. And that's the temptation, I think, maybe in a particular way for men, is that when that which is difficult, which is often just living out your duty, becomes increasingly difficult, the temptation is just bail out. It's like that which is hard must be an obstacle to what I'm really wanting, which is some degree of happiness. And it's like, no, press in, go through it.
You lean into it. Yes, please. And back to this point about happiness, right? So years ago, I confronted a man who was leaving his wife and I think 8 kids. And I told him, I said, you can't do this. This is gravely wrong. And he said to me, Father, God wants me to be happy. And I don't, I mean, once you're at that point, I don't know what to, how to respond to that, because there's so much that's wrong there, that wanting just the easier route. This is the call that all fatherhood is ultimately sacrificial, right? That Christ reveals the Father most of all on the crucifix. And so all fatherhood is sacrificial. And so we're tempted to cut corners on things because it's difficult, or because it might ruffle feathers, or just call more out of us. That's a reminder. Well, fatherhood is not a privilege, right? It's a duty. I guess it's a privilege in a sense, but it's not a luxury. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's not a luxury.
From my vantage point, it seems like the church is placing a little bit more emphasis sort of on the human formation side in priestly formation and in lay formation as well. Maybe sort of drawing on some of the things that we've been talking about, like in your experience, both in terms of formating, young men, but also just having lived the priesthood for 27 years. Why is that important? Why is the human formation piece so important, especially today? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the theological reason is because grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. We never trivialize the natural virtues, or what has come to be called human formation, just those natural virtues that are inculcated, ideally inculcated in a family. And the reason that in formation programs, the church is putting more and more emphasis on human formation is because it's so lacking in so many situations, people coming from complete wreckage in their families. And I mean, that's always been the case to some degree. But if you just think about the number of people who are coming from broken families today as compared to 70 years ago, I mean, it's so much higher. And another reason is because just the guardrails of society have been removed. Christ has come to perfect our humanity, and to show us, what it means to have a human nature, and to live an authentically happy human life. If we don't have a concept of humanity and what it means to be human, we're going to have difficulty understanding Jesus Christ, because he reveals himself to us by way of his sacred human nature. And he does that first in a family, just everyday thing. We're talking about dressing, how you dress. These seem to be tangential, and people would say unimportant things, but no, actually they're important, because they get to just those foundational virtues that the pagan world had, right? In our Lord's day. I mean, the ancient pagans, I mean, they had their problems, but they had a concept of virtue and how one ought to live and how one ought to speak and act and so on. And so those things that I think kind of precede the gift of ordination and the grace of ordination, that those are in place. In the seminary, the line was, as the seminarian, so is the priest, which meant like, if you can't get up for the 6:30 mass in the seminary, there's not going to be this magical transformation that gets you to get up for the 6:30 mass when you're in the parish. And so, being dutiful, being disciplined, being courteous, polite, courageous. We could just think of all of these human virtues that really need to be built up, and those become, when those are infused by the grace of ordination, they become something very beautiful. But those really need to be in place in order for the other things really to have that atmosphere, that soil. That's the good soil which the grace falls.
Yeah. It's funny. I always see similarities between sort of the vocation that I have as a husband and a father and that of the priesthood, because we have marriage formation, marriage preparation, which, does a good job of preparing couples to get married. But if you think you're done learning about being married the day you get married, it's not going to go well. In a similar way with the priest, right?
Sure. My spiritual director, when I was ordained, he said it takes a while for the psychology to catch up with the ontology.
Yeah,
In other
exactly.
words, it takes a while for you to adjust that. Oh, yeah. In fact, when my first year in the parish, I was the first probably month. I was up in my room, and the receptionist down in the office buzzed me, and she said, "Father Scalia, there's someone down here who would like to speak to a priest." And I thought, "Yeah, so." And then it was, "Oh, that's me. I'm the priest."
Yeah.
But no, this is right. So when I work with engaged couples at the rehearsal, I pull them aside and I kind of just talk to them, just the three of us, and I say, "Well, so are you guys ready?" And inevitably they say, "Oh yeah, we're ready." And I just shake my head. I said, "No, you're not. You're not ready at all." And I don't like the term marriage prep,
Right.
because marriage prep gives the impression that, oh, once we're done, you'll be ready for marriage. No, you won't. You'll just be slightly less unprepared. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of emphasis put by the bishops, by the Holy See, and by the bishops on ongoing formation as well,
Yeah.
because it can be a very, very bad thing when a priest just halts his theological reading or his prayer or his discipline that he had in the seminary. It just stops. That's a very dangerous thing. He has to grow into his priesthood more and more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas that I have accompanied clergy is in leadership development. And, some people would say, well, we need to put this in the seminary. I'm like, no, that actually is a
Right.
dumb idea. That's like having extensive parenting teaching for engaged couples.
Right.
There's no context, right?
Years ago, I was at a conference and Scott Hahn was speaking. I ended up seated next to Kimberly Hahn, and they're just such great, great people.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Kimberly Hahn about marriage prep, and she said, Father, when they really need it is not so much ahead of marriage, but 5 years in, which is absolutely right. And so one of my parochial vicars and I have talked about the idea of re-Cana. You've got pre-Cana,
Yeah.
we'll do re-Cana. And,
Yeah, exactly.
and it hasn't gotten off the ground yet, but I think that's an important thing to do, is just, okay, you've been at this 5, 6, 7 years. How's it going? Let's, brush off all those things that you were told during marriage prep and never listened to.
Right. Oh, that's so important. Father Paul, I think we're going to pause there, partly because I want our conversation to be a segue into the next time we can have a conversation. And there's still a lot more for us to talk about.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Thank you for coming on this. Thank you for all the yeses that you've given. Thank you for the witness. Thank you for, just being committed and dedicated and passionate about all the right things. Love your ministry. Appreciate you immensely. So thank you very much.
Brett, thank you so much. It's been a real treat to be with you.
We'll talk again. Listeners, I hope this has been a blessing to you. I'm sure it has been. Until next time, God bless you.